Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to AI for Good. We hope that all you and your families, your friends, and your colleagues are all keeping healthy and safe. My name is Guilherme Martinez Roura from the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, and it is a privilege to introduce today's session. The ITU is the United Nations Specialized Agency for Information and Telecommunication Technologies, and we are also the organizers of the AI for Good, in partnership with 38 UN sister agencies and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of the summit is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. We are pleased today to discuss the robots, artificial intelligence, regulation, and the SDGs. This is part of the AI for Good programming track, where we discuss the role of robotics in achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. But before I introduce our moderator today, let me begin with a couple of housekeeping rules. Your microphone has been disabled, so please only use the Q&A and chat functionalities to communicate, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Please make sure to set the chat message recipient to all panelists and attendees, and not just to all panelists. You can select this just above the message box. We have a distinguished set of panelists today, but as always, we are counting on you, the participants, to help create a very interactive session. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our great moderator today. Her name is Soledad Atienza, and she's the Dean of the EA Law School. Soledad, welcome, and the show is all yours.
Thank you very much, Guilherme, for the introduction and for inviting me to participate in this exciting event about robots, artificial intelligence, and regulation. I would like to start by introducing the speaker that we have today, with who will be talking to us about this topic and with whom we will establish a hopefully interesting debate. Simon Chesterman is the Dean and Provost Chair Professor of the National University of Singapore. He is Senior Director of Artificial Intelligence Governance at IE Singapore, and he is the co-president of the Law School's Global League. Welcome, Simon. And before I give you the floor, Simon, for your words on robots, artificial intelligence, and regulation, I would like to briefly introduce the set by mentioning how society has evolved by adjusting to globalization, and how we are now in this, we all feel part of this global society, and we are living the transformation to a digital society. This is where I think the conversation and the debate lies, and what is the task of lawyers, judges, legal profession, regulation in this digital society, and how lawyers are the architects of society and are responsible for giving solutions, not only from a legal perspective, but also from a moral and an ethical perspective to the situations that to the new situations created by the use of technology, robotics, and artificial intelligence. And with this, I give the floor to Simon Chesterman, and in a while we will start, hopefully, an enriching debate.
Thanks so much, Soledad. Thanks, Guillaume, for organizing this, and thanks to everyone for joining us. So yes, I'm the Dean of a law school, so I have a vested interest in lawyers. But one of the fascinating things I've discovered moving into the AI space is what's probably obvious to most people, which is that lawyers only have one perspective on many of these issues. And what we really need is to bring together many perspectives. So if you're not a lawyer in the audience, don't worry, there's not going to be a lot of legal jargon. But I am going to try and address the challenge that Soledad has laid out, which is what role law can play in bringing the many benefits of AI, in particular, helping us achieve things like the Sustainable Development Goals, as Guillaume highlighted, while mitigating some of the risks. And ideally, that's the role law should play. Law law should be, I mean, maybe the architect is the right word, or maybe the fireman or the safety net. It should be a mechanism that helps ensure public good for as many people as possible while mitigating risks. Although one of the things I'll turn to later on is that there are actually quite discrete ways of addressing this challenge in the context of AI. So that you're not just looking at my background, which is the beautiful Bukit campus of NUS, although Soledad at IE Law School has a beautiful campus of her own that I'm, fingers crossed, going to be visiting in February next year. But let me put up some slides to help organize my thoughts. So this is We the Robots is the title of the book that I will shamelessly plug at the end of my presentation. But what I'm really interested in is this regulatory challenge, like what role law can and should play in helping us get the benefits of AI while mitigating the risks. So a little bit of background first. This is a photograph many of you will have seen before, perhaps. It's from 1956. It's the iconic photograph of the people at the conference in Dartmouth College where the term artificial intelligence was coined. And it's kind of fascinating for two reasons in retrospect. One is it reflects the enormous ambitions and at times irrational optimism of some of the people involved in artificial intelligence. Because these guys got a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation on the basis of a short paper that said they thought they could solve many of the problems of artificial intelligence if they were just given enough money to spend 2 months over a summer working on it. And clearly, 1956 is not when we solved the problems of AI, and indeed the mismatch between expectations and reality over the years has been a real problem for artificial intelligence. So that's one thing to take away from this. The second thing to take away from it is the extraordinary lack of diversity, all white men, basically. And that's been a real problem for AI over the years, partly the people who are working on it, and partly the data that it is working with. And so bias in AI, conscious or unconscious, is one of the things that has also bedeviled artificial intelligence. A third thing, however, that has bedeviled artificial intelligence is fear, concern, misunderstanding. This, from about a decade later, is another iconic image, one perhaps that more of you will have seen, from the film 2001, Stanley Kubrick's film, Arthur C. Clarke's novel published in the same year, which really highlighted the existential angst around a lot of AI, epitomized by Hal the computer explaining to his human crew that his mission was more important than their lives. And so this sort of fear of technology, I suppose, is not unique to artificial intelligence. It's quite common with new technologies to have people expressing concerns. But one thing that has been striking about AI is that the people articulating those concerns often are the people that know most about it. So these are not crazy people articulating concerns about AI. People like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, the late Stephen Hawking have all expressed fears that AI could prove to be an enormous danger to humankind. So the possibility of AI helping us is very real. The prospect of it harming us is also possible. A lot of this was largely theoretical until quite recently. So this is an image from a previous AI for Good Global Summit. I think it was 2017. And this is Sophia, the citizen of Saudi Arabia. And I put citizen in scare quotes because one could have an interesting argument about that. But with entities like Sophia being given citizenship, with the European Union in the same year outlining in a report that maybe we should think about personality, legal personality for AI systems, these things started to become more realistic. More realistic both in terms of the benefits that they potentially offered humanity, in terms of optimization, increased efficiency, the ability to distribute resources more effectively and efficiently. These have enormous prospects for achieving goals like the Sustainable Development Goals, but also those lingering fears about the possible harms associated with AI also continue. So what are we actually talking about? I won't go into a lot of technical detail, but by artificial intelligence, I'm using it pretty broadly to refer to cognitive functions that would typically be carried out by a human being carried out by a machine. I'm talking mostly about narrow AI rather than general AI. So I'm not going to be focusing really on sort of robot consciousness, robot rights. We can get into that in the Q&A if people are interested. A particular aspect of artificial intelligence that is the reason why we've had such advances in the last decade or so is machine learning. And that is the ability of a computer system to improve without additional human input. So to increase its capacity on its own. And robotics is how these entities, how these techniques interact with the world through engineering processes. So if you combine AI and ML, you get things like AlphaGo, the program that beat the world champion Go player, Lee Sedol, back in 2016. You combine AI and robotics, and you get things like autopilot. You combine robotics and machine learning, you get things like the Roomba that can navigate its way around your house while vacuuming up the floor. So what is the regulatory challenge here? What's so hard for artificial intelligence? What is the problem that artificial intelligence poses to traditional legal regimes? And the reality is a lot of artificial intelligence can just be managed by existing legal structures. But there are some challenges, and I'll give you 3 key examples of challenges that AI poses to traditional regulatory structures. And the first is speed. This is not unique to artificial intelligence. Many computer systems operate faster, more efficiently than humans do, and that poses some regulatory challenges. And one example is the flash crash of 2010. So this came after the global financial crisis of 2008-09, but it was in 2010 that the New York Stock Exchange had its biggest point drop in its history, losing $1 trillion, about 1,000 points, in a 30-minute period. And then in the next 15 minutes, it regained almost all of that loss. And at the time, no one knew what was happening. And basically what transpired is that it was high-frequency trading algorithms, so computer programs that would buy and sell. And so if Soledad and I were deciding to buy and sell items, obviously it takes a little while for us to agree on it. But if it's 2 computer programs, they could do 10,000 transactions every second. And so this spiraled very quickly out of control. So if you're doing things at human scale, if there is the beginning of a problem, securities regulation rules can kick in and you can slow things down and you have more time to react. What the high frequency trading algorithms revealed was that we needed new systems to be able to sort of interrupt those processes, circuit breakers, before the problem would get out of control. And so this phenomenon of speed really does challenge artificial intelligence, challenges the ability of regulatory structures, regulatory processes that presume human speed interactions when those things are accelerated to the point that it's no longer realistic for bureaucrats to simply slow things down. And occasionally that does actually create a possibility that AI will play a role in regulating itself, which is something else we might get into. So that's the first problem, speed. Computers are fast. That's not particularly new, no real revelation there. Secondly, and more unique to artificial intelligence, is autonomy. This is the ability of AI systems to take decisions without additional human input. And this does appear on its face to pose regulatory challenges. For example, an autonomous vehicle, if there is no one in the driver's seat and a car crashes into you, who is to blame? Should we blame the car? So in some ways, this is novel in terms of technology, but it's not actually that novel in terms of potential legal difficulties. I mean, if I injure Soledad because I negligently crash my car into her, she might sue me. But if I injure her because I'm parked next to her and my car blows up, she might be able to sue the manufacturer of the car. And that's basically what we're seeing with driverless vehicles. We are likely to see a shift in responsibility from drivers to manufacturers. And one of the interesting things here is what happens at that, as that sort of the agency of the human diminishes or the agency of the machine increases. So the Society of Automotive Engineers has given us a series of levels of autonomy, 1 through 5 or 0 through 5. At level 0, the human's doing everything. Level 1, you might have things like cruise control. Level 2, you have lane assist that sort of keeps you on track. Level 3, you can let go of the wheel, but you've got to be ready to grab the wheel at any moment. Level 4, you can basically take a nap. And level 5, there might not be a steering wheel at all. And what's interesting is that manufacturers have understood and psychologists have studied the fact that the most dangerous level is level 3. Because if a human is told he or she can release the steering wheel, but must be ready to grab it at any moment. Actually, it turns out we're terrible at that because our mind starts to wander. And indeed, that was what happened in the first ever autonomous vehicle that crashed into a pedestrian back in Arizona in 2018, when a human driver in an Uber vehicle was meant to be ready to seize the wheel at any moment, but in fact was watching a streaming video of a reality singing program at the time. So autonomy does pose some problems, but the legal problems, in fact, aren't that complicated, provided we can rely on things like product liability. It does become a bit more of a challenge in the context of criminal law, where if I run a red light in my car, I'm to blame. If a driverless vehicle runs a red light, who is to blame? But that raises more interesting questions, not about whom you should charge with a criminal offense, but why we have a criminal law at all and why we would think about charging a robot in the first place. So that's the second set of problems, perhaps, autonomy, in addition to speed. The third problem that AI systems pose, and this is much more recent and more unique to AI, the most unique of the three problems, is opacity. And this is the phenomenon of being difficult to understand. Now, opacity is not in itself new. We've long had various aspects of life that are kept confidential by companies. This could be pharmaceutical ingredients, the secret sauce that McDonald's uses, and it includes computer programs, some of which are kept proprietary, so we don't know exactly what's going on inside. Law can deal with that through a subpoena, through a court order. You can require that it be opened up. Nothing particularly novel there. There are also aspects of life that are just complex, that require experts to understand. And also, that's nothing particularly new. Courts have long relied on expert witnesses to help them understand things. A judge in a lawsuit doesn't need to be a rocket scientist in order to determine liability if a rocket crashes. But what we're seeing now in AI is the phenomenon of natural opacity. This is computer processes, deep learning methods that are literally impossible for humans to understand. Billions of variables that in order to achieve a degree of fidelity, it's so complex that it would never be explicable by a human. And then you have a trade-off that if you want it to be understandable by a human, you need to reduce the complexity, which might in turn reduce the accuracy. And this becomes a particular issue when there are creative processes at work. For example, there is a lawsuit, well, there have been a series of lawsuits around the world launched by another academic, Ryan Abbott, who tried to make the argument that an AI system should be labeled as the inventor of a product for the purposes of a patent application. And until recently, all of those lawsuits in the EU, the US, the UK were unsuccessful. But I'll come to a postscript to that story at the very end of my presentation. So how does law respond to this? Well, for actually most of the history of AI, we didn't get much further than this guy. And if we were doing this in person, I'd ask someone to put their hand up and identify them. Actually, I might even see if someone can identify them in the chat. The first person to identify him gets a round of applause. Very good. Webinar attendee. Sorry, you were anonymous, so you get no prize. But yes, you identified Isaac Asimov. So Isaac Asimov, one of my favorite science fiction authors as a kid, not so great as a legislator. He's famous for his books, in particular for the 3 laws of robotics that he came up with. A robot may not injure a human, it should obey orders, it should protect its own existence. And really for almost 70 years, from 1942 up until this decade, the middle of this decade really, I would say, we didn't get a lot further than that. And the problem with Asimov's laws is that people misremember his legacy. His legacy is not of being a legislator, his legacy of being a storyteller. And if his stories had been about his laws working, they would have been boring. Actually, his stories are all about how his laws didn't work, how the robots had conflicts. It was impossible. They couldn't apply them to the circumstances. Yet what we saw, even when in the 2010s, we realized we needed some kind of legislative framework, we needed some sort of guideline, there was this rush to come up with new principles, lists of ethics, and this is just a survey of some of them, that tried to come up with a list of principles, guidelines, frameworks, ethical rules that would help us solve the problem of artificial intelligence regulation. And the problem with this is that it misunderstands the problem as too hard and as too easy. It misunderstands the problem as being too hard because you don't actually need to reinvent the wheel. You don't need to come up with entirely new principles because, as I'll say in a moment, many of these principles can just be applied. The problem is rather in application. And that's where these guidelines, principles, and frameworks misunderstood the problem as being too easy, in that it was assumed, I think, by many that if only we had the rules, then applying them would be less of a problem. Actually, it's the other way around. We have most of the rules. The problem is precisely in application. So why did all this happen around 2016 through to 2018 in particular? Why this burst of activity? Well, I think it was partly the advances in machine learning that we saw. So you had a greater sort of expansion of the technology, but we also had very graphic demonstration of the real world impact of the misuse or abuse of data and machine learning techniques, of algorithms that could change not just how a particular car drove, but how arguably an election could be swung. And so it was around 2018 that the Cambridge Analytica scandal broke, and it was in that same 6-month period that IBM and Microsoft and Facebook all adopted their own ethical principles on AI. So this is where we are now. I think one of the questions is what the rules should say. And I think it's a shame that many people focus on this sort of what question. So all of those guidelines that I put up a moment ago, they basically, there's a high degree of overlap that you end up with 6 principles being articulated. And I don't disagree with any of these. Human control sounds good, transparency, safety, accountability, non-discrimination, privacy. All of these are good things. To me, the key question is, are they necessary? Do we need these new rules, or are we reinventing wheels unnecessarily? Safety, for example, is really another way of saying product liability should apply to AI systems. Accountability, civil and criminal law should apply. This is a basic idea that you shouldn't be able to do through an AI system what you can't do yourself. That if I can't perpetrate fraud, then an AI system shouldn't be able to perpetrate fraud on my behalf. Non-discrimination. I'm not meant to discriminate. The AI system I rely on shouldn't be able to discriminate either. We should both be bound by human rights principles. Privacy, data protection law should apply. There is an argument that human control and transparency are a little bit different. Human control in the sense that that's not just a matter of saying that AI systems should benefit us, but that we should continue to be responsible for them. We should continue to ensure that AI systems operate to enhance human liberties rather than to replace human liberties. Transparency is the flip side of opacity. That if we're going to apply any of these other rules, one of the things that we need to do is understand not necessarily all of AI systems, but some AI systems. And I say not all because there are many areas of life where we don't need to understand every detail of a process. And probably medical technology is the easiest one to explain. That there are plenty of medical processes that we use based on their effectiveness as demonstrated in clinical trials, even if we don't understand at a molecular level how that process works. That's quite different from, say, a judge, where if there is a judge making determination, say, about the custody of a child or whether someone goes to prison, or a government official, whether a person gets a benefit or not, then we really do want to understand the reasoning process behind that decision. So there's an argument that human control and transparency are a little bit different, that might require some tweaks in how we think about regulation of AI. So when it comes to AI, I think really the question shouldn't be what we do in regulation. It should be, why are we regulating in the first place? So we regulate for all sorts of reasons. One is to address market failures. That is to say, with autonomous vehicles, for example, we don't want to unnecessarily endanger pedestrians and unnecessarily protect manufacturers. And so it would be a very dangerous world if we said that the pedestrians should just be careful not to get hit by autonomous vehicles, and there's no responsibility on the part of the makers of autonomous vehicles. So many times we are looking for efficiencies. We're looking for the market to operate optimally, the market to operate efficiently. Sometimes, however, we don't just care about efficiency. Sometimes we do want to maintain certain principles. We want to uphold certain social or other policies. For example, even if it were efficient for us to discriminate on the basis of race or sex in some areas, We shouldn't do so because discrimination is wrong, even if it were efficient, even if it would save money or time. That would be an inappropriate thing for us to tolerate. So that's part of the reasons why we might regulate, either to ensure the efficiency of the market or to uphold certain policies. The danger with regulation, and this is one of the reasons why many countries have been so slow to regulate AI in any hard sense, is there's a fear of constraining innovation or losing a competitive advantage. And here in Singapore, we've had quite clear examples of this. We did a review of the penal code, which literally concluded that we did not want to impose criminal liability on AI systems or on the developers of AI systems if it would unnecessarily constrain innovation and drive innovation elsewhere. And that's a real concern. But the danger is if you don't constrain, if you are so unwilling to constrain innovation, you might tolerate risks. And so that's a different kind of dilemma. In terms of this appetite for regulation, we've seen three quite different perspectives in the US, Europe, and China. The US obviously has been at the forefront of development of AI for many years, and its market-driven approach has achieved great things in terms of the huge companies that are very active in this sector, most of which, or a great many of which, tend to be in the US. Europe has adopted a different approach, much more of a rights-based approach, in contrast to the American market-driven approach. Europe, building on the Data Protection Directive in the 90s, the General Data Protection Regulation of a couple of years back, has now, in April this year, outlined a draft regulation on artificial intelligence. So much more of a rights-based approach. Until recently, China had adopted a third kind of approach, which was very sovereignty-focused. China's 2017, I think, national strategy on AI said, yes, we want regulation of AI, maybe by 2025, at some point in the future. And in the meantime, a lot of the focus of regulation in China has been through the lens of sovereignty, through the lens of national security, ensuring data localization of data to be held within China and subject to Chinese rules. This year, however, in fact, I think it comes into force next week, we've had legislation like the Personal Information Protection Act. So you have a move towards data protection there. I do want to leave time for discussion, so I'll do this bit reasonably quickly. The question of when to regulate brings to mind the Collingridge dilemma. This is a book written by David Collingridge 40 years ago. And his essential point was a really telling one, that at an early stage of the development of technology, that's when you could regulate it, but you don't really know what to regulate, and you worry about unnecessarily slowing innovation. But if you wait until you see the consequences of those innovations and the dangers that they pose, by that point, it might be very hard to regulate. And an example of this maybe is social media. That back in 2004, when Facebook was launched, if we'd known some of the things we know now, we might have changed the way in which social media companies were regulated, but we didn't. We are where we are now, and it's quite hard to roll things back, although there have been some efforts in different parts of the world to try and do so. In response, we have ideas that will be familiar to the international environmental lawyers, like the precautionary principle. That is that you shouldn't refrain from guarding against a risk just because the scientific evidence is not clear. And a different approach is masterly inactivity. That is the idea that you don't just do nothing, but you monitor, you engage, you establish sandboxes so that there can be experimentation with some degree of supervision. And that's an experiment we've been seeing in the financial technology, fintech space in particular. There tends to be an over-focus, I think, also on supply as opposed to demand for regulation. And this is really my last set of points before I open up to Soledad's questions and all of yours. So when I think about why we want to regulate, what are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to bring about through regulation? I divide it again into three buckets. And the first is there are some risks we just want to manage. In the case of autonomous vehicles, for example, we just want them to be safe. This is a pretty utilitarian set of concerns, and that highlights, I think, the thinking that could support achieving sustainable development goals if you can enable countries, enable jurisdictions to take advantage of these efficiencies while mitigating the risks. You get the greatest benefit to the greatest number. That's a good thing. But secondly, there are some red lines. And I think that one of those red lines should be lethal autonomous weapons. This has been discussed in other parts of the UN system in particular. And I think there is a strong argument that we do need to draw some red lines on artificial intelligence systems, AI systems, taking life and death decisions with regard to humans in the battlefield. Not because those decisions will be worse, but because they will be not taken by a moral entity and not taken by an entity that can be held to account. And if people are interested, we can go into that in discussion. A third category is process legitimacy. And this is the idea that we shouldn't be able to outsource some functions to AI systems in the same way that we shouldn't be outsourcing them to private entities. And I'm thinking in particular of public sector decisions. And probably the clearest example here is that of a judge. That a judge's decision is legitimate, not just because he or she is a brilliant judge, hopefully he or she is, but because he or she exists within a political hierarchy where there is accountability. And so there was a famous US Supreme Court judge, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said that the US Supreme Court is not final because it's infallible, it's infallible because it's final. Basically meaning that you need final decisions to be taken. And the legitimacy of that decision is not because the people taking it are so brilliant, but because they exist within a political hierarchy where they can be held to account for those decisions. And if we don't like those decisions, you can choose different people to make them in future. So the WHO should regulate this. I won't go into great detail. The possibilities include the ITU, ICANN is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. There's an interesting analogy you could draw with regard to climate change. My own take is to suggest maybe we could think about something that draws on the model of the International Atomic Energy Agency, a possible international artificial intelligence agency, partly because I think there are interesting comparisons to draw with the foundation of the IAEA in the 1950s, where we had, again, a technology with the potential for enormous benefit or enormous risk. And the grand bargain at the heart of that was to try and say, okay, we will distribute these benefits. We will distribute the technology so that you can get the benefits of nuclear energy, of nuclear medicine, of radiation-infused agriculture, while getting in exchange a commitment that the countries receiving this technology would not try and weaponize it and pursue nuclear weapons. And although we haven't been perfect on this front, it would be kind of pleasantly shocking to many of the activists in the 40s and 50s to learn that after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no nuclear weapons have been dropped in anger, and only a handful of countries have happily actually weaponized nuclear energy into nuclear weapons. But this is my second last slide. All this to say that it's a fast changing field. I mentioned the European Union's draft regulation adopted in April of this year. It wasn't long before consultants came up and said, all this is going to do is drive investment out of the EU. And that's a debate going on within the EU. In my own home country of Australia, a couple of months back, we had a different answer to that question of whether an AI system could be an inventor for the purposes of patent law. And in the same week that South Africa reached the same determination, we've had this finding, fascinating finding, that an AI system could be an inventor. But all of this is a provocation to conversation. Here is the shameless plug of the book. With that, I'm looking forward to Soledad's questions and comments, and indeed all of yours. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Simon, for a very clear and very holistic explanation of robotics, artificial intelligence, and regulation. I do have a few questions, and I see there's also quite some interesting questions from the audience. I would like to start asking you about the connection of artificial intelligence to the legal profession and to justice administration. Do you see here rather an opportunity to improve justice administration and the legal profession, or a threat? And I mean in the line of how can artificial intelligence be of use to making a judgment? How can artificial intelligence be of use to having a critical legal opinion?
Yeah, thanks so much, Soledad. And I'll give a shout out to IE Law School and the work you've been doing, Soledad, on legal technology. Because I think I'll talk about the promise, and then I'll say a little bit about possible threats. The promise is access to justice. I mean, I run a law school, I train lawyers, my graduates go out and make good livings, offering services that are important, but many of which should be free. I mean, it shouldn't be hard to write a will, to purchase a property, to engage in basic transactions. A lot of these things, candidly, a lot of legal work is repetitive. The transactional work is often quite repetitive, and some of these things can and should be automated. And so if legal technology can increase access to justice by reducing the costs of those transactional things, then that would be a benefit. In disputes, I think one of the most, a reasonably well-known example of a pretty simple, it's not really AI system, a simple example of legal technology is the do not pay chatbot, which was just a structured way of talking people through how to get out of a parking fine. And now this has been extended to various other disputes with government. And again, that's something that a lot of lawyers do, which is merely applying sort of an organized set of principles to asking a series of questions. And that's also something that can be automated. So I think in terms of basic transactions, then I think there is a possibility of increasing access to justice, but also on basic disputes. I mean, this is where, in terms of the SDGs, there is a really interesting conversation to have about whether you could see with legal technology the kind of advances that we've seen with telecommunications technology, with many countries in the developing world adopting mobile phones, leapfrogging the stage where you have to build elaborate telecommunications networks. And so if you could have certain forms of transactions, certain forms of dispute settlement procedures that were automated, that might be a lot easier in some jurisdictions than building up the traditions of a rule of law, training all the judges and so on. The danger is the more complex the dispute and the more political the dispute, the less it is susceptible to regulation through AI. And here the problem is that AI is quite good. A lot of AI and machine learning in particular is essentially very, very sophisticated statistics. And it's regression analysis that enables us to draw connections and make predictions, not about really the future, but make predictions about what the past would have become today based on past activity. So that's very helpful if you're predicting the weather, for example. But if we were actually to hand over complex disputes, really problematic disputes to AI systems, it would be extremely conservative because one of the reasons why lawyers remain in business is that the law changes, that the law is complex. I mean, many disputes that actually end up in court don't end up in court because one side's right and the other side is idiots. They end up in court because both sides have sophisticated lawyers who've reached different conclusions, and they need a third person to reach a final conclusion, sometimes then an appeal to reach a very final conclusion. And I don't think you could hand that over to an AI system. Again, going back to the reason I said in the presentation, that the legitimacy of the decision is not because it's necessarily right. The legitimacy of the decision comes from the identity of the person who's making it. And so that I think is the limit. And so at the sort of in terms of access to justice, I think there's enormous potential, but we still want to retain human oversight of this because justice is not something we can outsource.
Oh, thank you, Simon. And I agree that there are benefits and there's also dangers about machine learning and artificial intelligence in justice administration. But all in all, I do see an opportunity to improve and to make, in particular, to make justice administration more efficient and more accessible to all rather than a threat. And there's one more question before I take all of these questions from the audience. And you were comparing the regulation in different regions, in the US, in the European Union, China, and Singapore, and Singapore. And I know you on your book you give a full description of this. Do you think is there a need and further is there an existing or will there be an existing global regulation for artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so that's the part of the presentation I whizzed through, but I think you've put your finger on a real challenge, that one of the defining characteristics of AI, of technology generally, is it's global. And so the problem with, there are problems with self-regulation and there are problems with national regulation. The problems with self-regulation are that companies exist, for the most part, to make money. Milton Friedman famously said, the business of business is business. Now that is changing. The great late John Ruggie spent a good portion of his life focusing on business and human rights. I think there's an increasing realization that corporate actors have triple line obligations in terms of the triple bottom line. There's increasing focus on ESG, environmental sustainability, governance questions. I think many corporate actors are realizing that they have responsibilities above just making profits. But one of the reasons I got into this research in the first place is talking with technologists who said, look, computer programmers, their job is to solve little problems. It's not to see the real world implication of their solutions. And so you need different levels. So yes, self-regulation, companies doing the right thing will be important, but you need more than that. So governments are really where the rubber hits the road. Governments are the entities, states are the entities, whether we like it or not, they're the entities with the coercive capacity to adopt laws, to impose fines, to send people to prison if need be, and they will be essential. And I believe they'll be the most important actor in terms of hard regulation. The problem is technology isn't territorially bound the way states are. And so if some states impose regulatory regimes, that might work within those states, but it will usually not apply elsewhere. We've seen interesting dynamics here where the European Union has had an outside impact, in particular on data protection. So around the world, there are companies that have only a tiny footprint in the European Union that nonetheless apply GDPR principles across the board. And I think there are some people within the EU who are placing a bet that the EU can do the same thing here. This is not unique to data protection. The US Food and Drug Administration equally has an impact around the world because some companies will try and maintain those standards. But I do think some truly global regime is going to be necessary. And my concern at the moment is that you have this sort of dividing up of the world. We do have, the slide was up very briefly, the Global Partnership on AI, which the US joined, but the US only joined the Global Partnership on AI because it was clear that they were also going to exclude China. And I think unless you can get the big players like the US and China involved in that discussion, it's not going to be meaningful. And again, that's why I draw on the example of the IAEA, back in a time of superpower rivalry, which was much more intense and potentially dangerous as between the US and the Soviets than it is now between the US and China. And yet there was an ability to reach some kind of agreement back then. So yes, I think we'll definitely need some global level of coordination at least, but most of the regulation will happen at that state-based level.
Yeah, so global regime or at least some harmonization among national jurisdictions. Let me pose to you, Simon, some of the questions by the audience. How do you see artificial intelligence helping achieving the UN SDGs, or at least getting close to these targets?
Yeah, so some of the problems of the SDGs, and I won't go into all 17 principles, but just to pick on a couple, some of it is access to resources, some of it is distribution of resources. And I think in both of those areas, AI offers the possibility of greater efficiencies in terms of maximizing access to information and to resources and then distributing most effectively and legitimately. In areas like education, I think all of us have learned that there are tools for educating people remotely, but also through interactive systems that can be deployed at scale. Some of this is quite old, but things like the Khan Academy, I think, has done a great deal to sort of leverage up to create opportunities for people living in environments where there aren't sort of strong educational systems, nonetheless to get access to that technology. There is still a threshold that you need, for example, an internet connection, you need a computer, But as the price of computing power goes down, as access to computing resources goes up, then I'm cautiously hopeful that AI can play this role in distributing the world's resources more effectively and potentially predicting some of our problems more effectively. I mean, the reason for many amounts of human misery is often just, it's not, I mean, occasionally it is evil, wicked people doing wicked things, but often it's ignorant people going about their business, not realizing the consequences of their action. And AI systems can, through their cold rationality, help us in that kind of utilitarian calculus. Okay, this is something AI systems are very good at. How do you get the greatest benefit to the greatest number? And that's my fairly general hope that AI can assist in all these ends.
Simon, one question again from the audience on an ethical issue, which is how could we handle issues which are not covered in the legal framework, but rather on an ethical one? And this is, do we need two sets of compliance, one for legal compliance of artificial intelligence and another one for ethical compliance? What is your thoughts?
So I used to be more cynical about this because this smacks of corporate social responsibility. And corporate social responsibility 20 years ago, I think there was a pretty strong argument that a lot of it was really marketing. And you could tell in some companies, corporate social responsibility existed in the marketing department. And that's what worries me, perhaps especially as a law professor. When people talk about ethics, it's a way of saying, well, we don't actually want to be held to what we say. We just want to try and do the right thing. And if we don't do it, we'll try harder next time. And to me, that kind of, there runs the risk of a certain woolliness that I prefer, at least in some areas, clear principles that will be applied consistently in terms of regulation. So what's an example of when you would talk about ethics rather than law? Well, how about being a good person, doing things for good purposes? Well, I mean, hopefully we're all doing that. But in what circumstances should law apply? I'm not sure. One idea that I think might have some traction is to borrow from a different professional discipline, from medicine. There is talk about a kind of AI developers' Hippocratic oath. So the doctors in many jurisdictions around the world, they've promised, first of all, do no harm. And I think that might be an area in which you could have a kind of ethical principle. But again, maybe it's my cynical lawyer's hat, but I do wonder about things that people say they will do without any obligation to be held to it. So yeah, long way of saying I'm a little bit suspicious of ethics because it sounds like people are virtue signaling. That is to say, they want to hold themselves up as virtuous, but not be held to account if they're not.
Because you were just talking about doctors, Simon. Let me read here another question from the audience, and I'm throwing to you here questions in all different aspects. So this might get complicated for you. What do you think about artificial intelligence in health, in diagnosis and surgery? What may be the conflicts of the problems here?
Yeah, so medicine is a fantastic field as an example because it offers, again, benefits and the risks. The benefits, I mean, on diagnosis, I mean, do you want your X-ray to be examined by a doctor who maybe she's looked at a couple of hundred X-rays in the past, or an AI system that's looked at millions of these? Now, the true answer is you probably want both. You want the doctor and the AI system to work together. But the ability to process information, to draw connections, to look for patterns, that's something that AI, I mean, humans are pretty good at it. AI is brilliant at it. The danger side is that our whole foundation of medical ethics and indeed medical law is premised on the doctor-patient relationship and patient autonomy. And the difficulty that AI systems pose in both those areas is the doctor-patient relationship presumes that the doctor understands what's going on, and that takes us back to the problem of opacity, that often the doctor might not, and that patient autonomy means the patient is making what's called informed consent. But if the patient doesn't understand the risks, then he or she isn't offering informed consent. And so I mean, I think this is an area we're going to see lots of activity. I mean, it's health and wealth, medical care and the financial world are at the forefront of applied AI systems at the moment. And I think in both those areas, we'll see huge advances. Personally, as long as the outcomes are good in terms of health, in terms of the medical field, I don't have a moral problem with doctors relying on technology they don't understand, because as my example of pharmaceuticals highlighted earlier, we do that all the time. We don't understand, to pick a more extreme case, in psychiatry, electroconvulsive therapy is sometimes used to treat depression. We don't know why it works, but it does, and it's applied. And sometimes that will be used, even though we don't at a deep level understand it. And I suspect we'll see similar things with certain AI systems coming into the medical field. Now, what this means for the profession of doctors is going to be a real challenge. And what it means for patients who are meant to rely on that sort of doctor-patient relationship will also be a challenge. I mean, the reason why doctors, I think their jobs will be safe is that there's a whole separate body of literature that shows that actually in the doctor-patient relationship, one thing that obviously affects patient wellness is the medicine, the procedure, the technology, the pharmaceuticals is of course enormously important, but so is that interpersonal relationship. So is the relationship with the doctor. And so everyone knows what a placebo test is. And there have been tests that sort of compare a placebo and the medicine, and the placebo sometimes works. But then there's a third set of tests where sometimes people have been given a placebo and told, I'm giving you a placebo, and they still have better outcomes than someone who had no contact with the doctor at all. Because that third group, even though they knew that they were getting placebo, they felt they were interacting with someone who cared about them.
Yeah. I see there's some parallelism between the medical profession and the legal profession, and how robotics and artificial intelligence can be of benefit to both, but I do not see them being a substitute for going to a doctor or talking to a lawyer. No, and let me take one more question from the audience before I give you another question that I myself have. And there's a few comments on how can robotics and artificial intelligence be of use to democracies against dictatorial regimes, and what are the risks for growing dictatorships and totalitarianisms here? What are the dangers for these kind of regimes?
Yeah, I mean, not to call it a dictatorship, but I did put up the image of Donald Trump, not to call him a dictator, but to say that there is a danger that algorithms can change not just your identity, but your elections. And I think the ability both to gather information and to manipulate people are key threats to democracy. Gathering of information, I mean, this is why the European Union is trying to put down a marker on things like real-time biometric surveillance. I think these sort of creepy technologies, that facial recognition that identifies you as you walk into a building without your knowledge, and in particular sentiment analysis that could be examining my face and determining whether I'm paying attention or not. I mean, as an educator, I can imagine that being quite attractive. If I could monitor the students, okay, who's dozing off, who's paying attention, but it's also kind of creepy. And it is telling that on facial surveillance, one of the first jurisdictions to ban facial surveillance was the city of San Francisco, right next to Silicon Valley. So this was not a bunch of people in ignorance being worried about technology. These are sophisticated people who know exactly what the technology could do, saying, we don't want it. And so I think that is one of the risks to democracies around the world. And on the flip side, you've seen dictatorships using surveillance technology, very sophisticated surveillance technology, to monitor their populations, to identify potential dissidents, and to silence them. And so I think I think the tools of artificial intelligence can operate both to undermine democracies and to strengthen dictatorships. And our task is to try and reverse that. Are there ways in which we can use AI to connect people, as we're all connected around the world, to reduce the attractiveness of extremism, on the political spectrum, and to encourage the better angels of our nature, perhaps, through our collaboration and connection.
And Simon, my last question to you is in the topic of legal education. And how do you think generally law schools are doing in this area? Do you think we're doing enough teaching and enough research about artificial intelligence and the law? And what do you think that law schools should be doing in this area? Again, both in teaching future regulators and future lawyers and future judges, and in doing research of what are the advantages and the risks out there. How do you think the legal community, the academic legal community, is doing here?
Yeah, and this is something on which you I know have worked very hard, and your colleagues at IE law schools are models of this. And like you, here in Singapore, and indeed around the world, we're in conversation about how to try and do two things with legal education. And that is to focus on the law of technology and the technology of law. And this maybe brings me back to the Sustainable Development Goals, because on the law of technology, this is how we regulate these new entities, how we, or whether they are entities, how we get these benefits while mitigating the risks, the law surrounding autonomous vehicles, the new medical technology. It won't just be law, it'll be insurance regimes and so on. And that I think is reasonably clear, how we do contracts through automated processes, distributed ledger technology and so on. The technology of law is how legal practice is changing. And that brings us back to this idea of access to justice, that lawyers shouldn't, I think it's amazing that in many jurisdictions, lawyers for a long time have operated on the principle that they get paid based on their effort rather than their outcome. They get paid on the input rather than output. So lawyers around the world, increasingly, it's changing, but lawyers around the world often charge based on the time they spend on a problem rather than the quality of a result. And that's kind of amazing. There's no other industry that's as protected as this. And I think in many developed countries, that model is changing because of market pressure. But I think it's a good thing that it changes, in particular in terms of these access to justice questions, how you establish dispute settlement regimes in countries without sophisticated rule of law structures. This technology of law does offer possibilities of peer-to-peer settlement. And just to give you a concrete example, eBay, for example, the online marketplace, does tens of millions of dispute settlements a year with no human involvement at all. And so you can imagine in countries where it's very hard to get a lawyer to do dispute work for you, if you could go into an online platform, a dispute resolution mechanism, and you could settle a dispute and then get on with your life, rather than waiting years for it to get through a court system, or turning to alternative processes like a local power broker, then that would be good for everyone. Yeah, so a long way of saying I think we've got a lot more to do within law schools, but the impact hopefully would go far beyond the law schools and help ensure access to justice for a far wider set of people.
Mm-hmm. No, what I agree, Simon, and what I see is that both in the discipline of law of technology and technology of law, there is a need, but what I see is a huge opportunity for law schools to do research and to train the future people who will have to solve these problems, to make their graduates more skilled and more employable, and to really ensure a more secure regulation of machine learning, robotics, and artificial intelligence. Thank you very much, Guillem, for organizing this session. And thank you very much, Simon, for this very, very holistic and I see also very highly appreciated by the audience. I don't know if you have had time to read the chat, but you have received a fantastic feedback from the audience.
Thank you, Soledad, and thank you everyone for your attention and your questions. And those of you whose questions weren't answered, I'll at least get Guillem to send them to me so that we have a record. Thanks very much.
Yeah, for sure, Simon. Well, thank you very much, Simon and Soledad, for a big thanks to all the participants for making it such an interesting discussion. We had lots of great questions. Some of them weren't able to be answered, but I will send to you them to you, Simon. And we'll get a lot of good insights in how artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotic systems need to be regulated at the international level. We are now opening a quick poll with one question. Please let us know how much you like this session. We also encourage you to check out the AI for Good program online to see more sessions that may be of interest to you. For example, on Tuesday next week, there will be a session on unleashing the potential of underwater marine robots for good with Sen Halpin, Vice President at Houston Megatronics, Sam McDonald, CEO at Deep Tracker, Richard Mills, Vice President at Kongsberg Maritime, and Nina Mahmoudian, Professor at Purdue University, and James Bellingham, Executive Director of the Hopkins Institute of Assured Autonomy. And on November the 30th, we'll be exploring how robots are saving life in disaster-hit areas. With that, we have reached the end of this keynote session, and we would like once again to thank everyone involved, our panel, our participants, our partners, sponsors, and co-conveners Switzerland. Thank you very much. And